Hey everyone, I'm Lighthouse Keeper here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Marcus Webb arrived at Heceta Head Lighthouse on a Tuesday morning, when the fog sat so thick against the Oregon coast that he couldn't see the ocean 200 feet below. Could only hear it. A constant grinding whisper like something breathing through broken teeth. The Coast Guard helicopter had dropped him at the access road 3 miles back, unable to land on the headland in the soup. He'd walked the rest, his duffel cutting into his shoulder, tasting salt and diesel fumes with every breath. The lighthouse keeper position wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Most lights ran automated now, maintained by quarterly Coast Guard visits. But Heceta Head, perched on its rocky prominence at 44 degrees 821, no wonder 24 degrees 737 W, had developed issues with its rotating mechanism. The Fresnel lens, installed in 1894 and still operational, required constant adjustment. Someone needed to be there. The Bureau of Land Management had posted the position quietly, looking for candidates with maritime experience willing to work alone for 6-month rotations. Marcus had been the only applicant. He was 42 years old, lean in the way of men who forgot to eat, with premature gray threading his dark hair. His service record was exemplary until 3 years ago when it wasn't. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, USCG, had commanded a rescue swimmer team out of Astoria. During a winter storm in 2012, they'd responded to a distress call from a fishing vessel, the Sally Mae, taking on water 18 miles offshore. The details didn't matter anymore. The 20-foot swells, the zero visibility, the way the boat went under before they could get all the crew off. What mattered was that Marcus had given the order to extract, to pull his swimmers back when the seas became unsurvivable. 3 fishermen had gone down with the boat. The inquiry cleared him. Standard procedure. Correct decision. He'd resigned anyway. The lighthouse keeper's residence stood separate from the tower, a white Victorian structure clinging to the cliff, like something that had forgotten how to let go. Marcus let himself in with the keys the BLM regional manager had mailed him. Inside smelled of old wood and mildew and something else, something like wet wool left too long in a closed space. The furniture was minimal. A narrow bed, a kitchen table, 2 chairs, a wood stove that would be essential once the autumn storms arrived. The windows faced west toward the ocean, though fog pressed against the glass now like an animal seeking entry. He dropped his duffel and checked his phone. 1 bar of signal, enough to text the BLM office that he'd arrived safely. Then it was gone, the bar flickering out like a candle. The satellite phone they'd provided sat in its charging cradle on the kitchen counter, bright yellow and chunky, meant for emergencies. Everything else was up to him. The manual waited on the table, a 3-ring binder with plastic sleeves and water stains, standard operating procedures for light maintenance, emergency protocols, weather reporting. Tucked inside the front cover was a folded piece of paper, handwritten. Marcus, couldn't do the handoff in person, sorry. Had to get out. You'll figure out the routine. Lens needs checking every 4 hours. Gears need oiling daily. Fog comes in most afternoons. Log everything in the book. The book is important. Don't go down to the tide pools at night. Just trust me on that one. K. Brennan. Marcus read it twice. The handwriting got shakier toward the end, letters crowding together. He checked the manual's cover sheet. Kenneth Brennan, previous keeper, tenure, 4 months. The position was supposed to be 6-month rotations. He made a note to ask the BLM office about the early departure, then realized he had no signal to send the message. The lighthouse tower stood 50 yards from the residence, connected by a gravel path. Marcus walked it in the afternoon, the fog beginning to thin enough to show him fragments of the world, black rocks below, the white building of the old keeper's quarters, that now served as a bed and breakfast for tourists, closed for the season. The tower itself was 56 feet of whitewashed brick, crowned with the lamp room where the Fresnel lens rotated like the compound eye of some mechanical god. He climbed the spiral stairs, 53 steps, his boots echoing. The lamp room was circular, windows on all sides, the lens in the center mounted on its clockwork gears. The mechanism was beautiful in the way old engineering was beautiful, all brass and precision. A weight-driven system descended through the tower's core like a grandfather clock. Every few hours, Marcus would need to wind it, keeping the lens rotating, keeping the light sweeping across the shipping lanes. The logbook sat on a small desk beneath the west window, leather-bound, thick with years of entries. Marcus opened it to the most recent pages. Kenneth Brennan's entries started normally enough. Weather observations, routine maintenance. Then, about 6 weeks in, the tone changed. October 14th, 2015. Oro 200 hours. Woke to sound of dripping water. Checked entire residence, no leaks found. Sound continued for 40 minutes, then stopped. October 17th. Fog extremely heavy. Could swear I saw lights in the water about 100 yards offshore. Checked maritime traffic, nothing reported in area. October 21st. Found wet footprints on tower stairs, leading up. I live alone here. October 28th. The dripping again. It's coming from inside the walls. I know that's impossible. November 2nd. Something wrong with the radio. Picks up voices sometimes, not Coast Guard frequency. Old-fashioned speech patterns. One of them was calling for help. The entries became shorter after that. Dates without observations. Then, on November 8th, the final entry. They're not ghosts. They're still drowning. Every night. Forever. The page after was water-damaged, swollen and stiff, stained with salt rings. Marcus closed the book slowly. His hands were steady. That was training. Coast Guard drilled you to stay calm, to process information without panic. But something in his chest was tightening, and he recognized it. Not fear. Not yet. Anticipation. The feeling you got approaching a disaster scene, when you knew something terrible waited but didn't know its exact shape yet. He checked the Fresnel lens, verified its rotation, noted the time in the logbook with careful precision. November 10th, 2015, 1600 hours. Monsieur Webb assuming duties. All systems operational. His handwriting looked solid and controlled. Professional. Nothing like Brennan's deteriorating scrawl. The fog lifted that evening, revealing the Pacific in shades of gunmetal and slate. Marcus stood at the residence window and watched the sunset paint the water orange, then red, then purple. The lighthouse beam began its rotation, sweeping across the darkening ocean in precise intervals. Below, the tide pools formed black pockets among the rocks, filling and draining with the surge. Kelp beds swayed in the current like the hair of drowned women. He made dinner from the supplies the BLM had stocked. Canned soup, bread, instant coffee. The wood stove pushed heat into the small space. Outside, the beam continued its endless revolution. Marcus had thought the light would comfort him, a constant companion in the darkness. Instead, it made the shadows jump and shift, made the corners of the room pulse with rhythm of the sweep. At 10 p.m., he climbed to the lamp room to wind the mechanism. The clockwork descended through the tower's hollow core on a cable, like the pendulum of some enormous timepiece. He cranked the windlass, watched the weight rise, felt the resistance of all that brass and iron. The gears clicked and whispered. The lens rotated. Outside the windows, the beam cut through the night, illuminating nothing but darkness and more darkness. That was when he heard it, dripping. Slow and steady, water falling on stone. He froze, listening. The sound came from below, echoing up the spiral stairs. Marcus descended slowly, checking each level. The tower had no plumbing. The walls were solid brick, sealed and painted. Yet the dripping continued, seeming to move as he moved, always coming from somewhere else. At the tower's base, he stopped. The sound had shifted again, now coming from above. He stood in the dark stairwell and listened to water that shouldn't exist falling on stone that should be dry. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a ghost of signal catching the tower somehow. A text from 3 hours ago, just arriving. M. Webb, BLM here. Got your arrival confirmation. FYI, K. Brennan checked himself into Providence Seaside Hospital psych ward day after he left the light. Thought you should know. Stay safe. District Manager Torres. The dripping stopped. Marcus stood in the silence and felt sweat cooling on his neck despite the autumn chill. The lighthouse beam swept past the tower windows, illuminating him in 3-second intervals. Light. Dark. Light. Dark. In the darkness between sweeps, he could hear the ocean below, that constant grinding whisper. He went back to the residence and didn't sleep. The next 3 days passed in careful routine. Marcus treated the lighthouse keeping like a Coast Guard posting. Meticulous logs, regular maintenance, everything by procedure. He checked the lens every 4 hours. He wound the mechanism. He reported weather conditions to the automated NOAA system via the satellite phone. He noted everything in the logbook in steady handwriting. He didn't mention the dripping, which he heard every night now, always when he was in the tower. He didn't mention the wet spots he'd found on the stairs, even though the tower had no leaks. He didn't mention that when the fog rolled in, which it did every afternoon, he sometimes saw dark shapes in it, man-sized, that vanished when he looked directly at them. Training. Training told you to trust your equipment, your senses, your judgment. Training told you that stress could create false perceptions. Marcus had been through enough trauma to know what his own mind could do when pressed. The Sally Mae went down 3 years ago, but he still dreamed about it. The screaming on the radio, the moment the boat's lights vanished beneath the waves, the 3 men they couldn't save. Survivor's guilt, the therapists called it. PTSD, hypervigilance, intrusive thoughts. Maybe that's all this was. His mind creating patterns, seeking threats. The isolation getting to him like it had gotten to Brennan. On the 4th night, he forced himself to go down to the tide pools. The path was steep, cut into the cliff face with a chain-link handrail that rattled under his grip. November wind came off the ocean in gusts that could knock a man sideways. Marcus descended slowly, using the flashlight from his emergency kit. The beam splashed across black rock, tidal pools reflecting like broken mirrors. At the bottom, the ocean was louder, immediate. Each surge sent spray across the rocks. The tide was going out, leaving foam that glowed faintly in the darkness. Marcus walked among the pools, boots crunching on barnacles, looking for what? Evidence? Explanation? He found it in the largest pool, 50 feet across, carved deep into the bedrock. Rope. Thick hemp rope, gray with age, coiled at the bottom of the pool. Marcus crouched and reached for it, his hand breaking the cold water's surface. The rope felt slick, organic. He pulled. It came up heavy, dragging something with it. For a moment his mind filled in what that weight might be. A body, bloated and boneless, 3 years old. But what emerged was just more rope, ending in a frayed loop. A noose, or an anchor line. Hard to tell which. You shouldn't be down here. Marcus spun, his hand going to where his service weapon used to be before remembering he didn't carry one anymore. A figure stood 20 feet away on the rocks, backlit by the lighthouse beam during its sweep. Male, medium height, wearing what looked like a heavy coat. "I'm the keeper here," Marcus said, his voice steady despite his hammering pulse. "Who are you?" "Same as you. Was anyway." The man stepped closer. In the darkness between lighthouse sweeps, Marcus couldn't make out his face. "Kenny Brennan came back to warn you. You're in the hospital in Seaside." "Yeah, well, they let me out during the day, long as I check in by 9. Took the bus up the coast. Had to see if..." Brennan trailed off, looking toward the lighthouse. "You been hearing it, the dripping?" Marcus said nothing. "You have. I can tell. And you've seen the wet spots, the footprints. Found anything else yet?" Brennan's voice had an edge like broken glass. "They come at night, from the water. They're looking for something. Or maybe they're trying to tell us something. I never figured out which. Mr. Brennan, you need help. Let me call the Coast Guard, get you." "I don't need help. I need you to understand. There was a shipwreck here, 1936. The SS Iowa, grain carrier out of Portland. Hit the rocks in a storm. 27 crew. Only 5 made it to shore. Brennan pointed toward the dark ocean. "The rest of them are still out there, still drowning, every single night, forever." The lighthouse beam swept over them. In its brief light, Marcus saw Brennan's face, hollow-eyed, unshaven, skin with the gray cast of someone who hadn't slept in weeks. But what made Marcus's stomach drop was the water. Brennan's coat was soaking wet, dripping onto the rocks even though he'd supposedly walked down from the road, even though it hadn't rained. "You need to leave," Brennan said. "Before they realize you can hear them too. Before they start." Another surge crashed across the rocks. Spray filled the air. Marcus reflexively closed his eyes against the salt. When he opened them 2 seconds later, Brennan was gone. Marcus spent an hour searching the tide pools with his flashlight, calling out. Nothing. Just rock and water and the grinding whisper of the sea. Finally, he climbed back to the residence and called the hospital in Seaside on the sat phone. "Kenneth Brennan?" the night nurse said after checking. "He's here. Been here all day. Had a difficult night? We've got him sedated. He's not going anywhere." Marcus hung up without explaining. He sat at the kitchen table as the lighthouse beam swept past his windows and tried to make the pieces fit. Hallucination, stress response, his mind creating figures out of fog and shadow. But the rope in the tide pool had been real. He could still feel its texture on his palm. He opened his laptop, no internet, but he'd downloaded reference materials before leaving civilization. He searched his saved files for SS Iowa 1936 and found a scanned newspaper article from the Portland Oregonian, dated March 15, 1936. Steamer lost off Hesed ahead. 22 feared dead. The article detailed the disaster. The SS Iowa, a coastal grain carrier, had fought through a late winter storm and struck submerged rocks near Hesed ahead at approximately 2:30 a.m. The ship went down in less than 10 minutes. 5 crew members reached shore. 22 bodies were never recovered. Marcus studied the grainy photograph accompanying the article. A group of survivors on a dock wrapped in blankets, staring at the camera with the peculiar stillness of traumatized men. He zoomed in on their faces, memorized them. Then he read the survivor testimonies. "The sea just took them," one reported. "Dragged them right off the deck. Didn't even have time to scream. I could hear them calling for hours afterward," another said. "Voices in the water, but when we'd shine the lights there was nothing there. One of them, Jenkins I think, he made it to a rock. We all saw him. He was waving at us. But every time a wave came he'd go under, then come back up. For 3 hours. 3 hours. Then he was just gone." Marcus closed the laptop. His hands were trembling now, the calm finally breaking. 3 years ago he'd listened to men drown over the radio while his helicopter circled in a storm. He knew the sounds, the panic, the way voices changed as water filled lungs. He looked at his phone. No signal. The satellite phone sat yellow and reassuring in its cradle. One button press, and he could call for extraction. Medical emergency. Psychological distress. They'd have him off this rock by morning. Instead, he climbed to the lamp room and wound the mechanism. The next week passed in a fog that had nothing to do with weather. Marcus maintained the light because that's what he'd agreed to do. He logged everything except what mattered. Every night the dripping came. Wet footprints appeared on the tower stairs, going up, always up, toward the lamp room, the light. He found more rope in the tide pools, coiled and ancient. He saw shapes in the fog that moved like men moving through water, struggling against current. And he heard voices. They came through the walls at night, thin and desperate. Always at 2:30 a.m., the exact time the SS Iowa had struck the rocks. Calls for help. Names. "Charlie, I can't. Hold on, just hold. God, I can't feel my legs." Marcus would lie in bed and listen and feel salt water in his lungs that wasn't there. His last rational thought was that he should use the satellite phone. Call Torres at BLM. Report the situation. Request relief. But every time he reached for the yellow handset, his hand would stop. Because part of him, the part that had pulled his rescue swimmers out of the water while men drowned, the part that carried 3 years of guilt, that part wanted to hear the voices, needed to hear them, deserved to. On the 8th night, he went to the tide pools at 2:30 a.m. The ocean was calm, unusually so, like glass under the moon. The lighthouse beam swept overhead in its precise rhythm. Marcus stood at the edge of the largest pool and waited. They came from the water, not emerging, manifesting. One moment the pool was empty, the next it was full of them, shapes that were almost men, almost solid, forms made of foam and shadow and reflected light. They struggled in the pool, fighting to reach the edge, hands grasping at rock that their fingers passed through. Their mouths opened and closed. Their eyes were holes. Marcus counted 22. They didn't see him at first. They were too busy drowning, had been too busy drowning for 79 years, would be drowning forever unless what? One of them noticed him. Its head turned, water streaming from where a face should be. It reached toward him. Its mouth shaped words. Help us. Marcus did what he'd been trained to do. He reached back. His hand passed through the figure like passing through cold smoke, but the contact was enough. Information flooded into him, not words, not images, but knowledge, sensation, memory. The SS Iowa hitting the rocks, the hull splitting, water so cold it stopped thoughts. Darkness, panic, the desperate swim toward lights on shore, the lighthouse, its beam sweeping across the chaos. Safety. Just reach the light, and they'd be saved. But the rocks, the current, the undertow dragging them down and down and down. 22 men dying within sight of the lighthouse, within reach of rescue, drowning while the light passed over them indifferently. And the worst part, they were still reaching, still swimming toward the light, still believing rescue was coming. The moment of death caught in an endless loop, replaying every night at 2:30 a.m., forever. Marcus pulled his hand back. The figure dissolved into foam. Around him, the others continued their silent struggle, clawing at rocks, at each other, at the hope that would never arrive. He ran. Back up the cliff path, his boots slipping on stone, the chain-link handrail cutting his palms. Behind him, the tide pool churned as 22 men drowned and drowned and drowned. The lighthouse beam swept over everything, steady and mechanical and utterly blind. In the lamp room, Marcus wound the mechanism with shaking hands. The gears clicked. The lens rotated. The light went out into the darkness and returned, out and back, an automated heartbeat that had never missed a beat since 1894. He thought of Kenneth Brennan, sedated in a hospital room, still hearing the voices. He thought of however many keepers before Brennan, all of them alone on this rock, all of them listening to men drown every night while maintaining a light that existed to prevent exactly that. The logbook lay open on the desk. Brennan's final entry stared up at him. They're not ghosts. They're still drowning, every night, forever. Marcus picked up the pen. His hand was steadier than it should be. Coast Guard training, muscle memory. Even when everything inside was screaming, you maintained the logs, you recorded the data. He wrote, November 18th, 2015, 02:45 hours. Full manifestation confirmed in North Tide Pool. Count, 22 individual entities, SS Iowa crew, trapped in death moment. Rescue impossible, light insufficient. He stopped. Read what he'd written. Light insufficient. The thought arrived fully formed, terrible and inevitable. If the lighthouse hadn't saved them in 1936, if its light had been inadequate then, what made him think it would be adequate now? What was he maintaining? What purpose did this endless mechanical rotation serve? Marcus looked at the Fresnel lens, at its beautiful prismatic glass, at the bulb burning in its center. A bulb that had been upgraded over the years, made brighter, made more reliable, made more perfect. But perfect for what? To warn ships away from rocks? The SS Iowa had seen the light, had probably steered toward it, thinking it meant salvation. The light had lied. The thought grew roots. Over the next 3 days, Marcus maintained the mechanism while something inside him corroded. He wound the gears. He checked the rotation. He logged everything in handwriting that remained professional, even as his mind bent like steel under pressure. But he also went to the tide pools every night at 2:30 a.m., watched the 22 men materialize and drown, memorized their faces from the newspaper photograph, called them by name. Jenkins, Kowalski, Davis, Martinez. They didn't respond. They were too busy dying. On the fourth day during the afternoon fog, Marcus found all the rope from the tide pools coiled on the lamp room floor. He hadn't brought it there, hadn't touched it since that first night. It sat in neat concentric circles, dripping salt water onto the wood, and he understood it was a message. That night, he didn't wind the mechanism. The clockwork ran down around 9 p.m. The lens stopped rotating. The light continued burning, but fixed now, pointing out to sea in a single direction. Marcus stood and watched the sweep stop, watched the beam become static, and felt something in his chest release. The satellite phone rang. He let it ring 15 times before answering. "Webb? Torres here, BLM. Your light's out. Well, not out, but it's not rotating. Coast Guard got concerned. You okay up there?" Marcus looked at the fixed light, at the rope on the floor, at the tide pools visible 200 feet below, where 22 men were currently drowning. "The light's wrong," he said. "What?" "No, the bulb's fine. We can see it from shore. It's just not moving." "Did the mechanism break?" "It's wrong," Marcus repeated. "It doesn't help." It never helped. The SS Iowa saw the light, steered right toward it. It brought them here. Silence on the line. Then, "Webb, listen to me. I'm calling the Coast Guard. We're coming to get you. Just stay calm, okay? Don't touch anything. We'll have someone there in 30 minutes. Marcus hung up. He picked up the rope. It felt solid now, real, heavy with purpose. The 22 men who had spent 79 years reaching for rescue that wouldn't come, they had pulled the rope from the water for him. They had shown him what the light really was. Not a beacon, a lure. He tied one end to the lamp room railing, made a loop in the other. The knot was perfect. Coast Guard training, muscle memory that wouldn't fade even when everything else did. Outside the windows, the fixed light burned into the darkness, pointing at nothing. In the tide pools below, 22 men drowned. The helicopter's rotors reached him as distant thunder. They were coming. Would pull him off this rock like they'd pulled him out of the storm 3 years ago. Would put him in a clean white room like Brennan and tell him his mind had broken under the strain. Would medicate him until the voices stopped. But the voices wouldn't stop. That was the terrible truth he'd learned. Kenneth Brennan wasn't crazy. The nurses and doctors and psychiatrists, they just couldn't hear what he heard. Couldn't see what Marcus saw now with perfect clarity. Some rescues fail, some people drown, and some lights don't save anyone. They just mark the place where salvation ends. Marcus Webb put the noose around his neck as the Coast Guard helicopter came over the headland, its searchlight sweeping through the fog. Below, the tide pools churned. The men reached upward, still reaching, still believing. And the lighthouse light burned on, fixed and steady, and absolutely useless. They found him hanging in the lamp room, the mechanism unwound, the lens stopped. The rope was standard hemp, the kind used on ships in the 1930s, though there was no explanation for how it got there. His face was peaceful, the coroner reported. No signs of struggle, like he'd simply decided to stop. The BLM closed Hecate Head Lighthouse permanently after that, automated the light completely, boarded up the keeper's residence. But the automation failed within a week. The lens froze in place, pointing out to sea at a fixed angle. Engineers came, replaced the system, upgraded everything. It failed again. Now the lighthouse stands dark most nights. The beam comes on occasionally, randomly, like something restless trying to wake. When it does, people in the town 8 miles south claim they can hear voices on the wind, calls for help, names, and every night at 2:30 a.m. if you stand at the tide pools below the dark tower, you can see them. 23 figures now, 23 men drowning in water that's been gone for 80 years. One of them wears a Coast Guard jacket. All of them are still reaching toward the light that never saved anyone. Hope, you felt, genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real maritime folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The helicopter's rotors beat against the November wind like a dying heart, each pulse reminding Marcus Webb that he was choosing this. The pilot's voice crackled through the headset, something about weather windows and pickup schedules. But Marcus watched the lighthouse emerge from the Pacific mist and felt nothing except the familiar weight in his chest that had followed him for 3 years. St. George Reef Light rose from the ocean like a gravestone, its white tower streaked with rust and bird guano, waves exploding against the base in columns of foam that reached halfway up the 70-foot structure. 6 miles offshore, visible from Crescent City on clear days, invisible most others, the most isolated lighthouse on the California coast. Perfect. The Coast Guard had been surprised when he volunteered. Nobody wanted St. George. The reef had killed ships for 2 centuries, and the lighthouse itself had nearly killed its builders in 1892. 4 keepers had died here over the years, one swept away by a rogue wave, 2 others under circumstances the official reports labeled accidental. The station had been automated in 1975, but the Coast Guard still maintained it, and someone had to perform quarterly inspections after the automation equipment kept failing. The last keeper, David Henley, had vanished 3 months ago during his rotation. They'd found his skiff tied to the landing, his gear in the watchroom, his coffee still warm. No body, no note, just gone. Marcus had read the incident report on the flight from San Francisco. Standard missing person investigation, no evidence of foul play, presumed swept overboard despite the calm conditions that day. Case closed. He'd requested Henley's personal effects, the items too worthless for next of kin to claim: a box of waterlogged paperbacks, a portable radio, a journal. Marcus needed to understand what isolation felt like when it became permanent, when there was no rescue swimmer coming, no helicopter, no second chance. He needed to know if the weight ever lifted, or if it just kept pressing down until something inside finally cracked. The pilot set them down on the helicopter pad with practiced precision, the skids kissing concrete for barely 3 seconds. 2 weeks, he shouted over the engine noise. Weather's supposed to turn nasty, so if I can't get back on schedule, you might have another few days. Radio check every morning at 800. Miss one and we come looking. Marcus nodded, already unstrapping. He grabbed his duffel and the supply crates, waving the pilot off. The helicopter lifted, banking toward the mainland, and the sound faded into the ambient roar of the Pacific. Alone. The words settled over him like fog. He stood on the landing platform, tasting salt on his lips, feeling the structure vibrate beneath his boots with each wave strike. The lighthouse keepers who'd manned this station for 83 years had called it the dungeon. Now Marcus understood why. The isolation wasn't just physical, it was geological, atmospheric, cellular. The reef existed in its own pocket of reality, where the ocean was everything and the land was just a rumor. He hauled the supplies into the service entrance, a steel door set into the lighthouse's base. The interior smelled of mildew, rust, and something else, something organic and briny like seaweed rotting in a tide pool. The main level housed the diesel generators, now silent, replaced by solar panels and battery banks. The walls wept with condensation. Marcus had worked on enough vessels to know that smell, that particular cocktail of salt water and metal oxides that meant corrosion was eating everything from the inside out. He checked the generator log. Henley had run it twice during his stay, both times at night. Odd. The solar array should have been sufficient. The spiral staircase wound up through 5 levels. Living quarters on 2, galley and communications on 3, watchroom on 4, lantern room at the top. Marcus climbed slowly, his duffel scraping against the curved wall. The steps were worn smooth by generations of feet, and he found himself counting them, 42, 43, 44, the way he'd counted during his psych evaluation. The psychiatrist had asked if he was having suicidal ideations. Marcus had said no. It was true. He didn't want to die. He just wanted to stop feeling like he'd already failed at being alive. Level 2. The keeper's quarters were a 12 by 12 cell with a steel frame bunk, a desk bolted to the wall, and a porthole that looked north toward the mainland. Marcus dropped his gear on the bunk and stood at the porthole. The glass was thick, salt-crusted, distorting the view. Crescent City was invisible behind the weather front rolling in from the northwest. He could see the darker gray of the storm against the lighter gray of the overcast sky, a bruise spreading across the horizon. The Weather Service had called for 15-foot swells and 40-knot winds by midnight. Standard November conditions. The Lighthouse had survived worse. It would survive this. He unpacked methodically, spare clothes in the footlocker, toiletries on the shelf, laptop and satellite phone on the desk. Then he pulled out the box of Henley's belongings. The journal was on top, its cover warped and stained, pages rippled from water damage. Marcus opened it to a random entry, dated 2 months before Henley disappeared. Day 4. The sound at night isn't just waves. There's a rhythm to it, almost like breathing. Or maybe I'm just hearing my own pulse in my ears. The isolation manual says auditory hallucinations are normal. Your brain inventing stimulation when there's none. I keep telling myself that. Marcus flipped forward. The handwriting grew more erratic. Day 9. Something walks on the reef at low tide. I saw it through the binoculars this morning, moving between the rocks. Human-shaped but wrong. The way it moved. Too fluid, like it was part of the water. When I looked again, it was gone. Seal, probably. They sunned themselves on the South Rocks. That's all it was. Another entry, dated 2 days before Henley vanished. Day 15. It knows I'm watching. Last night I heard it on the ladder. The exterior maintenance ladder on the north side. Metal on metal. Rungs creaking under weight. I grabbed the spotlight and went to the gallery, but there was nothing there. Just the ocean. But the rungs were wet, Marcus. Fresh water, not salt, not spray. Like something had come up from below and brought the deep water with it. I collected a sample. I'm sending it with the supply drop. I need to know I'm not insane. The entry ended there. Marcus paged through the rest of the journal. Blank pages, except for the last one. A single word written so hard the pen had torn through the paper. Draugr. Marcus closed the journal. His hands were steady. He'd expected something like this. Isolation did things to the mind. He'd seen it in the Coast Guard, sailors on extended deployments developing paranoia, seeing threats that didn't exist. The brain wasn't designed for this kind of solitude. It needed social stimulus, variation, connection. Without it, the architecture started to crack. Henley had cracked. That's all this was. But the word bothered him. Draugr, Norse mythology. The undead sailors who guarded their treasure, dragging living men into the sea. Marcus had studied maritime folklore during his academy days, back when he thought understanding the old superstitions would make him a better rescuer. He'd learned about Davy Jones and the Flying Dutchman, about sirens and selkies and the ghost ships that appeared before storms. Draugr were different. They weren't ghosts. They were physical beings. Corpses animated by malice and the ocean's cold. They were said to be impossibly strong, their flesh bloated and gray-green, their eyes like dead fish. They could pass through solid rock, control the weather, and their touch caused madness. Sailors' stories, nothing more. Marcus set the journal aside and went to check the equipment. The watchroom occupied the 4th level, a circular space dominated by the massive Fresnel lens. The lens had been manufactured in Paris in 1891. Its prisms designed to magnify a simple oil flame into a beam visible 20 miles out. Now it housed a modern rotating beacon, but the old lens remained. Too expensive to remove, too beautiful to destroy. Marcus ran his hand along the brass frame. The metal was cold, almost painfully so, despite the heater running in the corner. He checked the rotation mechanism, functioning normally. The LED beacon, operational. The backup battery, charged. Everything was working perfectly, which made Henley's generator usage even stranger. He climbed to the lantern room and stepped onto the exterior gallery. The wind hit him immediately, 40 knots at least, tearing at his jacket. The sun was setting behind the storm front, turning everything the color of old bruises. To the north, Crescent City's lights were beginning to appear, faint pinpricks in the gathering dark. To the south, nothing but ocean. To the east, 6 miles of empty water to the mainland cliffs. To the west, 3,000 miles to Japan. Marcus walked the gallery, inspecting the railing, the ladder that descended to the service platform, the spotlight housings. Everything secure. No signs of tampering. No wet rungs. But as he turned to go back inside, something caught his eye. Below, on the reef at the lighthouse's base, rocks jutted from the water like broken teeth. The tide was going out, exposing more of them, and in the failing light, Marcus could see something moving between them. Something large. He watched it for a long moment, his rescue swimmer instincts kicking in. Assess the situation, identify the threat, determine response protocol. The shape moved with purpose, navigating the rocks with inhuman agility. Then it stopped, turned, and looked up at him. Marcus felt something cold slide down his spine. Not fear. He'd lost the capacity for fear 3 years ago. This was different. Recognition, maybe. The shape was too far away to make out details, but he could see its outline. Bipedal, broad-shouldered, moving in a way that suggested both human intelligence and something utterly alien. It stood there for perhaps 10 seconds, a figure carved from shadow and spray, and then a wave crashed over the rocks, and it was gone. Seal. Had to be. They were common in these waters, and in the failing light, imagination could turn a basking seal into anything. Marcus went inside, sealed the gallery door, and descended to the communications room. He ran the radio check, confirming signal strength with the Coast Guard station in Eureka. Then he heated a ration pack and ate without tasting it, his mind elsewhere. The coffee was instant and bitter. He drank 3 cups, knowing he wouldn't sleep anyway, and opened his laptop. He had downloaded files to occupy him, maintenance manuals, weather data, a few movies. But he found himself opening the browser, searching for information on St. George Reef. The reef had claimed 34 ships between 1852 and 1960. The most famous was the Brother Jonathan, which struck the reef during a storm in 1865. Of the 244 people aboard, only 19 survived. The ship had been carrying gold, $200,000 in coins and bars, bound for Portland. Some of it had been recovered by salvage divers, but most remained somewhere in the reef's underwater caves. The treasure hunters had given up by 1880. Too dangerous. Too many divers had died, tangled in kelp, crushed by shifting rocks, or simply vanishing into the labyrinthine passages that honeycombed the reef. The locals claimed the Brother Jonathan was cursed, that the dead still guarded their gold, that anyone who disturbed the wreck would join them in the depths. More sailors' stories. But Marcus found himself scrolling through dive logs and salvage reports looking for patterns. 3 divers had vanished in 1877, 2 more in 1883, 1 in 1891, the year the lighthouse opened. The last documented disappearance was in 1960, a salvage expert named Thomas Corrigan who'd claimed he could locate the main gold cache. He'd made 6 dives, mapping the underwater passages, reporting strange currents and unusual marine life. His last dive, he'd brought up a single artifact, a sailor's knife, encrusted with coral and barnacles but still recognizable. He'd told his crew he'd found something else too, something he wouldn't describe, something that had been watching him from the darkness. He'd gone back down to investigate and never surfaced. His body was never recovered. Marcus closed the laptop. He was doing exactly what Henley had done, inventing narratives to explain the isolation, the sounds, the shadows. The human brain couldn't accept emptiness. It filled voids with stories, turned random patterns into meaning. That was the real danger of places like this. Not the ocean or the rocks or the weather. The danger was what happened inside your own skull when there was nothing else to think about except how alone you were. He went to bed but didn't sleep. The lighthouse made noises, metal contracting as the temperature dropped, waves hammering the base, wind whistling through gaps in the gallery railing. And beneath it all, that other sound Henley had mentioned, that rhythm, like breathing. Marcus tried to locate the source, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, as if the entire structure was inhaling and exhaling. Probably the sea caves beneath the reef, air and water flowing through natural passages, creating pressure changes, perfectly explicable. But it sounded like something alive, something vast and patient, waiting just beneath the surface. At Oru 200, he gave up on sleep and climbed to the watchroom. The storm had arrived, waves breaking over the gallery, spray coating the windows. The lighthouse beam rotated through the darkness, illuminating sheets of rain. Marcus stood at the window and watched the ocean trying to reclaim the reef. In the gaps between waves, he could see the exposed rocks, and for a moment he thought he saw that shape again, standing at the base of the ladder, looking up. But then another wave hit, and when the spray cleared, there was nothing. He checked the security system. The lighthouse had cameras on the landing platform, the service entrance, and the gallery. All showed empty concrete and steel, rain-slicked surfaces, nothing moving. Marcus rewound the footage from sunset, watching it in fast forward. Empty, empty, empty. He was about to close the program when something in the gallery camera made him pause. He backed up the recording, played it at normal speed. There, at 21:45, just for a moment, a shadow moved across the lens. Not spray, not a bird. Something solid, something that blocked the infrared for exactly 3 seconds before continuing off camera. Marcus felt his pulse quicken. Not fear, curiosity maybe, or the faint stirring of something he'd thought was dead. He grabbed a flashlight in his jacket and climbed to the gallery door. The wind was stronger now, 50 knots, driving rain horizontal. He stepped out, playing the flashlight beam along the rail, the ladder, the surrounding structure. Nothing. He walked the full circuit, checking every section. The metal was wet, covered in spray and rain, impossible to tell if something had climbed it. He was about to go back inside when he noticed something on the gallery deck, near where the shadow had appeared on camera. Water, but not rain. This water was darker, thicker, pooling in a depression between deck plates. Marcus knelt and touched it. Cold. Impossibly cold. His fingers went numb instantly. He brought them to his nose. No salt smell. Fresh water, just like Henley had written. Fresh water 40 feet above sea level, in the middle of a rainstorm that was dumping salt spray everywhere. Fresh water that felt like it had come from somewhere very deep, where sunlight never reached, where the pressure turned everything alien and strange. He stood quickly, suddenly aware of how exposed he was. The flashlight beam cut through the rain, illuminating nothing but empty air and angry ocean. But he felt watched. The sensation was undeniable, primal, the same instinct that had saved his life a dozen times during rescues. Someone, something, was out here with him. He could feel its attention like weight, like hands pressed against his chest. He backed toward the door, keeping the light moving, scanning the shadows. The ladder creaked. Just the wind, he told himself, just metal flexing under stress. But the sound was rhythmic, deliberate, rung by rung. Something climbing. Marcus didn't run. Running would mean accepting this was real, and he couldn't afford that. He walked back inside, sealed the door, and threw the deadbolt. Then he stood there, listening. The wind, the waves, the breathing sound that filled everything. And now, barely audible beneath it all, something else. A wet, dragging sound. Something moving on the gallery, circling the lighthouse. Something heavy enough to make the deck plates vibrate with each step. He grabbed the spotlight remote and flooded the gallery with white light. Through the window, he could see the entire walkway. Empty. Nothing but rain and spray and shadows that moved with the storm. He killed the light and waited. 30 seconds. 1 minute. 2. The dragging sound stopped. Whatever had been out there was gone. Or waiting. Marcus went back to the watchroom and pulled up the camera feeds. He played back the last 10 minutes. The gallery camera showed him stepping outside, kneeling to examine the water, standing, backing toward the door. And then, just after he went inside, something moved into the frame. The image quality was poor, rain and spray obscuring everything, but he could see a shape. Tall, broad, moving with that same fluid wrongness he'd seen earlier. It approached the door, seemed to pause there, as if considering, and then moved out of frame toward the ladder. He checked the ladder camera. Nothing. The shape should have appeared there, descending, but the camera showed only empty rungs and rain. Marcus played it again. Still nothing. It was as if the thing had simply ceased to exist between one camera and the next, or passed through solid matter, like mist through a screen, like a drugger moving between the worlds of the living and the dead. No. Marcus slammed the laptop shut. He was doing it again, falling into the same trap as Henley, creating stories, finding patterns. The cameras were old. The image processing software was glitchy. Water was causing interference. That shape could have been anything. A bird, a tarp torn loose from the supply crates, a trick of light and shadow. And the fresh water on the gallery could have come from condensation, from a gap in the rainwater collection system, from 100 different sources that had nothing to do with something climbing up from the depths. He forced himself to go through the inspection checklist. Beacon, operational. Fog signal, tested and operational. Battery banks, charging normally. Solar array, minor efficiency loss due to weather. Generator, fuel level sufficient for 2 weeks of continuous operation if needed. All systems green. He logged the inspection results, sent the data to the Coast Guard via satellite uplink, and waited for confirmation. It arrived at 0312. Received, acknowledged, next check 0800, stay safe. Stay safe. Marcus almost laughed. Safe was a helicopter ride away. Safe was a hospital bed where they monitored your heart rate and asked questions about whether you'd made plans. Safe was anywhere but here, alone with the ocean's breathing and the sound of something circling the lighthouse in the dark. But he'd chosen this. He'd volunteered, signed the waivers, submitted to the psych evaluation. He'd told them he could handle isolation, and he'd believed it. Because what was isolation compared to the weight of failure? The memory of hands slipping through his grasp, the sound of someone screaming his name as the ocean took them. What was loneliness compared to that? He sat in the watchroom until dawn, monitoring the feeds, listening to the storm. The shape didn't return. The fresh water on the gallery evaporated, leaving only a faint stain. The sun rose behind thick clouds, turning the world from black to gray. The storm was moving south, the wind dropping to 30 knots. Marcus made coffee and climbed to the gallery to assess damage. The rail was bent in 3 places. Wave impact, probably. The spotlight housing on the south side had a crack. The ladder was intact. Everything was soaked, covered in kelp and small fish and pieces of something that might have been driftwood or might have been bone. He spent the morning on maintenance, tightening bolts, replacing blown bulbs, cleaning salt deposits from the windows. The work was mindless, methodical, exactly what he needed. Physical labor that required no thought, just the movement of hands and the flexing of muscles. He'd done this kind of work his whole career. Equipment maintenance, safety checks, procedures followed so many times they became automatic. It was comforting, predictable, real. At noon, the radio crackled. Saint. George, this is Coast Guard Station Eureka, radio check over. Marcus grabbed the handset. Eureka, this is St. George, reading you 5x5. All systems nominal. Over. Copy that. Weather's clearing. We'll have you on schedule for pickup. 2 days. Can you hold until then? Over. 2 days. Marcus looked out the window at the ocean, the rocks, the shadows between them. Affirmative. I can hold. Over. Good man. Eureka out. Marcus set the handset down and realized his hands were shaking, not from fear, from relief. 2 days. 48 hours. He could manage that. He could manage anything for 48 hours. He just had to stay rational, stay focused, ignore the sounds and the shadows and the feeling that he was being watched from somewhere beneath the waves. He ate lunch, crackers and canned soup, and tried to sleep. The exhaustion was overwhelming now. 36 hours without rest, his body demanding shutdown. He managed 3 hours, dreamless and dark, before something woke him. A sound. Metal on metal. Rhythmic. Deliberate. The ladder. Marcus was on his feet before full consciousness returned, moving on instinct and training. He grabbed the flashlight in his jacket and climbed to the gallery. The afternoon was clear, the storm blown through, the ocean almost calm. He opened the door and stepped out into crystalline air that tasted of salt and ozone. The sound was louder now, undeniable. Something was climbing the maintenance ladder from the service platform 40 feet below. He could hear each rung creaking under weight, could feel the vibration through the deck plates. He moved to the rail and looked down. At first, he saw nothing. Just the ladder, the platform, the ocean surging gently against the reef. Then movement caught his eye. Something on the ladder, perhaps 20 feet below the gallery. It was climbing with deliberate slowness, each handhold precise, each step measured. The shape was humanoid but wrong, the proportions distorted, the movement too fluid. As Marcus watched, it paused and turned its head upward, and he saw its face. Gray-green flesh, bloated and slick. Eyes that reflected light like a deep-sea fish, white and pupilless. A mouth that was too wide, lined with teeth that looked like coral. It stared at him for a long moment, and Marcus felt something break inside him. Not fear, not horror. Recognition. He'd seen dead men before, pulled them from the water, tried to breathe life back into drowned lungs. He knew what death looked like. This was death that had decided not to stay dead. Death that had learned to walk, to climb, to hunt. The thing resumed climbing. Marcus didn't move. He couldn't. His training screamed at him, assess, respond, act, but his body had forgotten how. He watched the creature ascend, its movements hypnotic, inevitable. Watched it reach the gallery rail. Watched it pull itself over, water streaming from its ancient clothing, from its hair, from the cracks in its flesh. Watched it stand there, perhaps 8 feet away, its dead fish eyes fixed on him. It spoke. The voice was like gravel dragged over metal, words shaped by a throat that had forgotten human speech. Draugr, it said. And Marcus understood it was answering a question he hadn't asked. It was telling him what it was, the way a storm announces itself with distant thunder. This is what I am. This is what's been waiting. This is why no one survives the reef. Marcus found his voice. You're not real. The thing tilted its head, considering. Then it moved, faster than anything that size should move, crossing the distance between them in a heartbeat. One hand, if it could be called a hand, those fingers too long, tipped with broken nails like barnacles, reached out and touched Marcus's face. The cold was absolute. Not just temperature, but the cold of the deep ocean, of places where pressure crushed steel, where no light had ever reached. The cold of death that wouldn't end. Marcus's vision doubled, his knees buckled, and he felt himself falling into darkness so complete it had texture, had weight, had sound. The screaming of drowned sailors, the creak of timbers breaking under pressure, the rushing of water into lungs. And then it was gone. Marcus was on the deck, gasping, his face numb where the thing had touched him. The gallery was empty. No creature, no water. Just him, alone, his heart hammering against his ribs. He scrambled to his feet and ran inside, slamming the door, throwing the deadbolt. His hands were shaking violently now. His breath came in ragged gasps. He was having a panic attack, something he hadn't experienced since the accident. He forced himself to breathe slowly, counting 1, 2, 3, 4, the way the therapist had taught him. Not real, hallucination, isolation-induced psychosis. Henley had experienced the same thing. That's why he'd written about Draugr, why he'd heard sounds, seen shapes. The brain, deprived of input, generated its own, created threats, invented monsters. It was a documented phenomenon. Marcus had read about it in the psych prep materials. This was textbook. All he had to do was recognize it, acknowledge it, wait it out. 2 days. He could survive his own mind for 2 days. But his face was still numb. He touched his cheek. The skin was gray, frost-marked, as if he'd been exposed to extreme cold. Frostbite, in 60-degree weather. He went to the first aid kit and found the thermometer. His core temperature was 96.7 degrees, hypothermic. He put on every layer of clothing he had, turned the heater to maximum, and huddled in the watchroom, trying to stop shivering. The sun set. The lighthouse beam rotated through the gathering darkness. Marcus monitored the camera feeds obsessively, watching for movement. The gallery stayed empty. The ladder showed nothing. But on the service platform camera, he could see something in the water. Shapes moving between the rocks. Not seals. Too large. Too deliberate. Too many. They surfaced and dove. Surfaced and dove. Their movements synchronized, as if they were searching for something. Or waiting. At 2100, the power failed. The LED beacon died. The heater shut down. The laptop went dark. Marcus grabbed the flashlight and found the electrical panel. The main breaker had tripped. He reset it. Nothing. He checked the battery banks. Dead. Completely drained, despite being fully charged that morning. He checked the solar array monitoring system. Offline. The backup generator. He'd have to start the backup generator. He climbed down to the service level, flashlight cutting through absolute darkness. The generator was a diesel monstrosity installed in 1956, rebuilt twice, temperamental and loud but reliable. Marcus had checked it that morning. Fuel, oil, coolant, all good. He hit the ignition. The starter motor groaned, turned over twice, and died. He tried again. Nothing. Again. Nothing. He opened the access panel and checked connections, looking for loose wires or corroded terminals. Everything was intact. He tried one more time, priming the fuel line, adjusting the choke. The engine caught, ran for 3 seconds, and died with a sound like choking. Marcus stood in the darkness, listening to water drip somewhere in the shadows. The generator should work. It had worked this morning. There was no reason for it to fail, unless something had sabotaged it. He played the flashlight around the room, looking for damage, for signs of tampering. The beam caught something on the wall near the fuel tank. Writing. Fresh. Scratched into the paint with something sharp. They want their gold. Marcus felt the cold return, spreading from his chest outward. Henley. This was Henley's handwriting. He recognized it from the journal. But Henley had vanished 3 months ago. This writing was fresh, the paint chips still on the floor beneath it, which meant either someone had been down here since Marcus arrived, or he heard a sound behind him. That dragging, wet sound. He spun, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Nothing. Just shadows and machinery and the constant drip of water. But the sound continued, circling him, staying just beyond the light's reach. Marcus backed toward the stairs, keeping the beam moving. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, joined now by others. Multiple sounds, multiple things, moving through the darkness with patient malice. He ran, up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, flashlight beam bouncing wildly. Behind him, the sounds followed, wet footsteps on metal, the scrape of something hard against the handrail, the rasp of breathing that wasn't quite human. He reached the living quarters level and slammed the door, bracing it with his body. Something hit the other side hard enough to buckle the steel. Marcus stumbled back. The door held, but he could hear them out there. Many of them. Circling the landing, testing the frame, their voices, if they could be called voices, making sounds that were almost words. He grabbed the satellite phone and dialed the emergency frequency. Static. He tried again. More static. The battery was full. The signal indicator showed 4 bars, but he couldn't get through. He tried the radio. Dead. The backup radio. Dead. Every communication system in the lighthouse was non-functional. He was cut off. Completely. Whatever was happening, he would face it alone. The scratching at the door stopped. Silence. Marcus waited, listening. Nothing. He approached the door slowly, pressed his ear against the metal. Still nothing. Then from above he heard it. That same dragging sound. But it was in the watchroom. They were already inside. Marcus grabbed the flashlight and the closest thing he could find that resembled a weapon, a pry bar from the toolkit. He climbed toward the watchroom, moving as quietly as possible. The sounds were clearer now. Multiple entities moving through the space, searching for what? Him? Something else? He reached the door and peered through the small window. The watchroom was full of them. 5, 6, maybe more. Draugr. Dead sailors from dead ships, their bodies preserved by cold water and something darker, something that had decided they weren't done yet. They moved through the space with purpose, examining the equipment, the walls, the floor, looking for something. One of them, the tallest, wearing the rotted remains of a 19th century uniform, stood at the window staring out at the ocean. As Marcus watched, it raised one hand and pressed it against the glass. Where it touched, frost spread in intricate patterns, geometric and beautiful and wrong. Then it turned and looked directly at the door, at Marcus. Its eyes were the color of deep water, of places where even light drowns. It moved toward him with that terrible fluid grace, and Marcus understood with absolute clarity that he was about to die. Not from drowning, not from the cold, but from something far worse. From being taken. From joining them. From becoming another Draugr, bound to the reef forever, guarding gold that no longer mattered, driven by hunger that would never end. The creature reached the door. Marcus raised the pry bar, knowing it was useless but unable to do nothing. The thing looked at him through the window, studying him with cold intelligence. Then it spoke, its voice like wind through a dead forest. "You let them drown." The words hit Marcus harder than any physical blow. His vision blurred, his hands went numb. The pry bar clattered to the floor. Because it was true. He had let them drown. The fishing vessel, 3 years ago, 6 crew members, storm force winds, 30-foot seas. He'd been the rescue swimmer. He'd gone in. He'd reached them, and he'd failed. The waves had torn his grip. The current had pulled them under. He'd watched them sink into the dark, their hands reaching up, their mouths open in silent screams. 6 souls, lost because he hadn't been strong enough, fast enough, good enough. The Draugr tilted its head. "Now you understand," it said. "Now you know why you're here. The ocean takes what it's owed, the reef remembers, and we collect the debt." The door opened. Marcus hadn't touched it, hadn't unlocked it, but it swung wide and the creatures filed out into the stairwell. They surrounded him close enough that he could smell them, salt and decay and the impossible cold of the deep. Their hands reached out, touching his face, his chest, his arms. Each touch brought more cold, more darkness, more of that drowning sensation. Marcus felt himself sinking, felt water closing over his head even though he stood on dry steel. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only feel the weight pulling him down, down into the depths where the drowned wait. And then, from somewhere distant, he heard a voice, his own voice. The one from 3 years ago, the one that had screamed at him to keep swimming, to keep trying, to never give up. That voice said, "Not like this." Marcus grabbed the flashlight, still clutched in his hand despite the numbness, and triggered the strobe function. Brilliant white light flashed through the stairwell once, twice, 3 times. The Draugr recoiled, their movements suddenly uncoordinated. He didn't know if it was the light or the simple act of resistance, but they fell back, and he ran. Down the stairs, through the living quarters, into the service level. The generator room. He needed light, needed power, needed something to break this impossible nightmare. The writing on the wall. They want their gold. Marcus understood. Not Henley's warning. Henley's solution. The Draugr guarded the brother Jonathan's treasure. That's what bound them to the reef. That's what kept them here, neither alive nor dead, trapped in perpetual service to gold that no longer had meaning. But what if the gold was gone? What if someone took it? Would they be freed? Or would they take that someone instead? He didn't have time to think it through. The Draugr were coming down the stairs. their dragging footsteps echoing through the structure. Marcus grabbed the fuel can from beside the generator and ran for the service entrance. He threw the door open and stumbled onto the landing platform. The ocean had calmed, the tide was low, and the reef was exposed. He could see the rocks, the gaps between them, the dark water in the tidal pools. And he could see something else, a glint of metal, 20 feet out, barely visible in the starlight. Something gold. He waded into the water. The cold hit him like a physical blow, taking his breath, making his muscles seize. But he pushed forward, climbing over rocks, sliding into pools, moving toward that glint. Behind him, he could hear the drogger emerging from the lighthouse, their voices raised in something that might have been anger or might have been hunger. The water was chest deep now, the current pulling at him. He reached for the gold, a coin, a single doubloon encrusted with barnacles but unmistakable. He grabbed it, felt its weight, its reality. Something wrapped around his ankle and pulled. Marcus went under, the cold water filling his nose and mouth. He thrashed, kicked, felt his boot connect with something solid. The grip loosened. He surfaced, gasping, the coin still clutched in his fist. The drogger were in the water now, moving toward him through the tide pools, their bodies perfectly adapted to this environment. He had seconds, maybe. He had to do something, had to make this count. He raised the coin above his head. "I'm taking it," he shouted, his voice raw. "Your treasure. I'm taking it away from this reef. You can follow it or you can let it go, but either way, you're done guarding it." The drogger stopped. For a long moment, they stood motionless in the water, their dead eyes fixed on the coin. Then the tallest one, the creature in the captain's uniform, moved forward until it stood directly in front of Marcus. It reached out with one long-fingered hand, not to take the coin, but to touch Marcus's chest, just above his heart. The cold spread from that point, but it was different now. Not the cold of death. The cold of deep water, yes, but also the cold of release, of something ending. "You tried to save them," the drogger said. Its voice was changing, becoming more human, more real. "You failed, but you tried. That matters. That pays the debt." Marcus felt tears freezing on his face. "I don't understand. The reef takes those who are owed, those who die protecting gold, those who die trying to save others, those who die with their duty undone. You came here to die, but you still tried to save yourself. That courage, that pays what you owe." The creature removed its hand. The cold receded. Marcus stood in the water, shivering, confused, the coin still in his fist. The other drogger were fading now, becoming translucent, their solid forms dissolving into mist. The captain was last. It looked at Marcus one more time, and in its dead eyes he thought he saw something like gratitude. "Keep the coin," it said. "Remember us. Remember that the ocean keeps its dead, until someone proves they deserve to live." Then it was gone. All of them were gone. Marcus stood alone in the tide pool, the coin heavy in his hand, the lighthouse beam rotating above him in silence. The power had returned. The beacon was working. The storm had passed. He was alive. He waded back to the platform and climbed into the lighthouse. Everything was as it should be. Generator running, lights on, heater warm, equipment functioning. As if nothing had happened. As if he'd imagined it all. But his clothes were soaked. His core temperature was dangerously low, and the coin in his hand was real. Solid. Heavy. Proof. Marcus spent the rest of the night in the watchroom, wrapped in blankets, monitoring the feeds. The cameras showed nothing. The ocean was calm. The reef was quiet. At 0800, the radio crackled. "St. George, this is Coast Guard Station Eureka. Radio check, over." Marcus grabbed the handset. His voice was steady. "Eureka, this is St. George. Reading you 5x5. All systems nominal. Ready for pickup, over." "Copy that. We'll have you out of there by 1100. Good work, Webb. Eureka out." Good work. Marcus looked at the coin, then at his reflection in the window. He looked different. Older, maybe. Or just more present. More real. The weight in his chest wasn't gone. It would never be gone. Those 6 souls would always be lost, and he would always be the one who couldn't save them. But maybe that was okay. Maybe carrying that weight was the price of being alive, of having tried, of being the kind of person who dove into storms because someone needed help. The helicopter arrived at 10:58. Marcus packed his gear, took one last look at the watchroom, and climbed down to the landing platform. The pilot helped him stow the duffel and supply crates, talking about weather and schedules and the relief keeper who'd be coming next week. Marcus nodded, half listening. As the helicopter lifted off, he looked down at the reef, at the rocks and the tide pools and the lighthouse standing alone against the Pacific. For just a moment, he thought he saw figures standing on the rocks, waving. But then the helicopter banked toward the mainland and they were gone. He kept the coin. They found it when he turned in his gear at the Coast Guard station, asked about it, but Marcus just said he'd found it on the reef. They let him keep it. He carried it for the next 20 years, a reminder that the ocean takes what it's owed, but sometimes, rarely, maybe only once, it gives something back. Not forgiveness, something better. Permission to keep living. Permission to remember that trying matters, even when you fail. Especially when you fail. The lighthouse still stands, automated now, maintained quarterly by keepers who spend their 2 weeks in isolation and return to land with stories of sounds and shadows and water where water shouldn't be. Most of them are transferred after one rotation. They don't say why. But sometimes on very clear nights when the fog lifts and the ocean is calm, you can see lights moving on the reef. Lights that don't come from the beacon. Lights that dance between the rocks like lanterns carried by sailors who haven't found their way home yet. And somewhere in Crescent City, Marcus Webb, retired now, living in a small house with a view of the ocean, stands at his window and watches the lighthouse beam rotate through the darkness. He knows what the lights mean. He knows who carries them, and on the worst nights when the weight gets too heavy and the memories too sharp, he takes the coin from his dresser and holds it tight, feeling its cold, solid reality, and remembers that he earned the right to be here. Not because he saved everyone, but because he tried. The ocean keeps its secrets, but sometimes if you prove yourself worthy, it lets you keep yours too. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real maritime folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. Marcus Sullivan's boots crunched through the frozen crust of March snow as he approached Split Rock Lighthouse for the first time as its keeper. The structure rose from the cliff edge like a sentinel carved from the same ancient stone, its octagonal tower stark white against the gunmetal gray of Lake Superior, stretching endlessly toward a horizon that merged sea and sky into one suffocating void. 38 years old, 12 years with the Coast Guard. Marcus had seen his share of maritime stations, but nothing quite like this. The lighthouse sat atop a 130-foot cliff of volcanic rock, accessible only by a winding path that had already left his calves burning. Below, the lake's surface churned with a violence that seemed personal, waves exploding against the cliff face and sending spray high enough that he could taste salt on his lips, though Superior was freshwater. The inconsistency troubled him in a way he couldn't articulate. The wind off the lake carried sounds that weren't quite wind sounds. Marcus told himself it was the unique acoustics of the cliff, the way the rock channeled and distorted the air moving across its face. He'd read about such phenomena in his Coast Guard training. Everything had an explanation if you looked hard enough, applied enough logic. That philosophy had served him well through a dozen years of maritime service, through investigations of vessels lost to equipment failure and human error, through the grim work of pulling bodies from cold water. The supernatural didn't exist in Marcus's worldview, only the unexplained, which was simply the not yet explained. The key scraped in the lock of the keeper's quarters, a 2-story brick building attached to the lighthouse tower. Inside, the air held a peculiar quality, simultaneously too still and somehow stirred by unseen currents. Dust motes hung suspended in the pale light filtering through windows that faced the lake. Marcus set down his duffel and moved through the rooms with professional efficiency, cataloging what he found. The previous keeper, David Brennan, had left in November, officially due to medical leave. The Coast Guard's briefing had been characteristically sparse on details. Equipment needed maintenance, winter supplies needed restocking, and someone had to keep the light operational for the freighters that still braved Superior's winter fury. In the office, Marcus found the logbooks arranged with military precision on metal shelving. He ran his finger along their spines, noting dates, feeling the texture of salt-stained covers. The most recent volume sat apart from the others, water-damaged and swollen, its pages rippled and stiff. Marcus opened it carefully. The entries began routine enough, Brennan's handwriting neat and controlled. Date, weather conditions, visibility, maintenance performed, vessels observed. Then, around late September, the handwriting began to change. The letters grew tighter, compressed, as if Brennan had been trying to fit more words into less space. The final entries from October were barely legible, written with such pressure that the pen had torn through the paper in places. Marcus brought the logbook to the window, tilting it to catch the fading afternoon light. The last entry read, "They come up from the Matafa, the drowned ones. I can hear them on the rocks after midnight, speaking in the old tongue. Dead languages from dead mouths. I've tried the salt barriers, but salt means nothing to those who drowned in fresh water. The handbook doesn't cover this. Nothing in the training covers this. They want the light extinguished. They want the ships to join them. God help me. Sometimes I think I understand why." Marcus closed the logbook slowly. The rational part of his mind immediately began constructing explanations. Isolation could do strange things to people. The lighthouse stood 15 miles from the nearest town, effectively cut off during winter storms that could last days. Sensory deprivation, cabin fever, the psychological weight of solitude, these were documented phenomena. Brennan must have suffered some kind of breakdown. The medical leave suddenly made more sense. Still, the specificity bothered him. The Matafa. Marcus knew the wreck. The ore freighter had run aground in a storm in November 1905, just offshore from this very lighthouse, which had been too new to prevent the disaster. 9 men had died within sight of rescuers who couldn't reach them through the storm. Their bodies had been recovered eventually, but stories persisted among the locals about strange sounds on November nights, about lights beneath the water where the wreck lay broken. Marcus checked his watch. 3 hours of daylight remained. He needed to inspect the light apparatus before dark, ensure everything functioned properly. The tower stairs spiraled upward, the metal treads echoing under his feet. At the top, the lantern room enclosed the original third-order Fresnel lens, a magnificent piece of engineering from 1910, its prismatic glass panels catching what little light penetrated the thickening clouds. Marcus ran through the inspection checklist methodically. Rotating mechanism functional. Ventilation clear. Glass panels clean. Backup generator tested. Everything worked perfectly. As he descended, Marcus noticed something he'd missed on the way up. Scratches on the tower walls, sets of 4 parallel lines scored into the paint. They appeared at irregular intervals, some chest-high, others near the floor. The pattern repeated down the stairs, always in sets of 4. Claw marks, his mind whispered before he could stop it. He pushed the thought away. Someone had probably moved equipment up and down these stairs, scraping the walls. Perfectly mundane. That night, Marcus ate a simple dinner of canned soup heated on the propane stove, then settled into the keeper's quarters with Brennan's logbook. He told himself he was looking for clues about equipment issues, patterns in weather that might explain the previous keeper's decline. But he found himself drawn to those final deteriorating entries, reading them over and over, trying to extract meaning from the increasingly frantic words. November 7th, 1905. One entry read, "That's when it started, when they went into the water. The Matafa broke apart and 9 men drowned within sight of this light. But the light was too new, too weak. We failed them. Every keeper since has felt it. The weight of that failure. They don't rest. How can they rest? They died seeing safety they couldn't reach. That kind of death creates something, changes something. The Vikings knew. They called them Draugr. the Norse word for those who can't let go of the world, even in death. Marcus looked up from the logbook. Outside the windows, full darkness had fallen, the kind of absolute black that only exists far from cities. The lighthouse beams swept past in its programmed rotation, briefly illuminating the snow-covered ground, the edge of the cliff, the churning darkness of the lake beyond. In that moment of illumination, Marcus saw something on the rocks below the cliff. Figures, perhaps, standing motionless in the spray zone where no one should be standing, where the waves would sweep anyone away in seconds. The light rotated away. Darkness returned. Marcus waited for the next rotation, counting the seconds. When the beam swept past again, the rocks were empty. He felt his heart rate slow back to normal. His eyes had been playing tricks, that was all. The mind sought patterns in darkness, manufactured shapes from shadows. Perfectly documented psychological phenomenon. He closed the logbook and went to bed, falling asleep to the sound of waves against stone and the distant mechanical rhythm of the rotating light. The sound woke him at 2:47 a.m. Marcus knew the time because the first thing he did was check his watch, as if establishing that concrete fact could anchor him against what he was hearing. Scraping, metal on stone, rhythmic and purposeful. It came from outside, from the direction of the tower. Marcus lay still in the darkness, listening. The scraping continued, punctuated by thuds as if something heavy was being dragged up the cliff face. He rose, pulled on his pants and boots, grabbed the heavy-duty flashlight from his pack. The keeper's quarters felt different at night, the shadows deeper, the still air somehow expectant. Marcus opened the door to the tower and paused. The scraping had stopped. The silence felt worse. He climbed the stairs slowly, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness ahead of him. The claw marks on the wall seemed more prominent now, as if they'd deepened since his afternoon inspection. Impossible, of course. At the top, the lantern room was empty. The Fresnel lens continued its rotation, the mechanism producing its familiar mechanical hum. Marcus checked the outside gallery, the narrow walkway that circled the lantern room. Nothing, just the wind and the darkness and the invisible lake below. He was about to retreat when his flashlight beam caught something on the railing. Water, not spray but pools of standing water, impossibly present on metal that should have shed moisture immediately in the below freezing temperature. And within the water, shapes, small objects. Marcus bent closer, training the light carefully. Teeth, human teeth, worn and yellowed, lay scattered in the pooled water. Marcus's training reasserted itself. He was looking at evidence. Something explainable had occurred. Someone had been here, had placed these things as a prank or a threat. He pulled a plastic bag from his pocket and carefully collected the teeth, sealed them, pocketed the evidence. Back in the quarters, he would radio the Coast Guard, report the situation, request guidance. Everything would have a rational explanation. But when he reached for his radio in the office, it produced only static. He checked the connections, the battery, the antenna. Everything appeared functional, but only white noise emerged. His cell phone showed no signal, which was expected this far from towers. Marcus tried the landline and found it dead. The weather, he thought. A storm must have taken out the lines. He'd noticed the clouds thickening before dark. He spent the rest of the night in the office, ostensibly to monitor the light, actually because the thought of returning to bed felt impossible. As dawn approached, gray and reluctant, Marcus found himself studying the water-damaged logbook again, this time reading entries from earlier keepers. Someone in the 1940s had written, "The old Norwegian families in the area have stories. They say this coast was settled by their ancestors who knew the signs. Draugr, the undead, those who died wrongly and cannot rest. They warned against building here. Said the rocks belonged to those below." A keeper from the 1970s found something washed up on the rocks. Looked like a hand at first, but hands don't move on their own. Hands don't leave wet trails back to the water. A keeper from 1993. "The dreams are the worst, drowning over and over, cold water filling my lungs. But I'm seeing it from their perspective." The men from the Matafa, seeing the lighthouse through the storm so close. watching it get farther away as the water pulls them down, waking up with my lungs burning like I really was underwater. Marcus closed the book as sunrise finally bled across the eastern horizon. The lake under morning light looked almost peaceful, its surface textured like hammered metal. He could see the town of Silver Bay in the distance, civilization reassuringly present. He told himself he would hike down, drive to town, use a working phone to contact the Coast Guard. But his watch showed him something he hadn't realized. He'd been awake all night, yet only 3 hours had passed. His watch read 5:47 a.m. Sunrise in March shouldn't come until after 7. He checked his phone. 5:47 a.m. The office clock. 5:47 a.m. All synchronized, all showing impossible time. Marcus opened the weather station data on the backup computer. Sunset yesterday, 6:15 p.m. Current sunrise, 7:23 a.m. The numbers didn't match what he'd experienced. Either all his timepieces were wrong or something had happened to his perception of passing time. The coffee he made tasted wrong, metallic and slightly rotten despite coming from a sealed container. He poured it out and watched it swirl down the drain, noticing how it left dark residue on the stainless steel, like sediment from standing water. The pipes groaned in the walls, a deep resonance that felt less like plumbing and more like something large shifting position in a confined space. Marcus forced himself through the day's routine, inspected the light mechanism, checked the fog signal equipment, inventoried supplies, noted weather conditions in the logbook, keeping his handwriting deliberately neat, controlled. Nothing like Brennan's deteriorating script. Normal. Everything was normal. The strange events had explanations he simply hadn't determined yet. But as afternoon wore into evening, Marcus found himself increasingly drawn to the windows facing the lake. The water had grown rougher, whitecaps visible even from this height, and there, among the waves, something moved with purpose. Dark shapes surfacing and submerging, too large for fish, too purposeful for debris. They seemed to be moving toward the cliff. Marcus watched until darkness made it impossible to see anything beyond the reach of the lighthouse beam. When the light swept across the water, he saw them clearly for just those few seconds per rotation. Things that might have been human once, floating upright in the water, their heads turned toward the lighthouse. 9 of them, arranged in a rough line, stationary despite the violent waves, waiting. He grabbed binoculars, trained them on the water during the next light rotation. What he saw in that brief illumination would replay in his mind in the days that followed. Faces, if they could still be called faces, skin the color of waterlogged wood, hanging in loose folds, eyes that reflected the light like an animal's but with something aware behind them. Mouths open in expressions that suggested pain, or hunger, or both. And they were closer than they'd been minutes before, impossibly closer given the distance, as if they'd moved during the darkness between light rotations. Marcus stepped back from the window. His breath came fast and shallow. The rational explanations were crumbling. He'd seen what he'd seen, bodies in the water, moving with intention, approaching the lighthouse. He thought of Brennan's words about salt barriers, thought of the Norse mythology references. Draugr. The word sat in his mind like a weight. The banging started at 11 p.m. Not the scraping from the night before, but impacts, heavy and rhythmic, against the tower base. Marcus descended the stairs with his flashlight and a flare gun, the only weapon he had. The sounds grew louder as he descended. At the bottom, the exterior door rattled in its frame with each impact. He could hear voices between the thuds, speaking in a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood the intent of. Rage, accusation, hunger. You failed us. The words came through the door, carried on the wind, in English now. The light that should have saved us, too weak, too late. 9 of us died seeing safety we couldn't reach. Marcus's voice surprised him by emerging steady. You're dead. You drowned in 1905. I wasn't even born. I didn't fail you. The banging stopped. In the sudden silence, Marcus could hear water running, though no pipes were nearby. Then the voice came again, multiple voices now, overlapping, male and female, speaking in unison. Every keeper inherits the debt. The light still burns. The promise still stands. But we drown anyway, over and over, reliving it. Can you understand? To die in view of salvation? To reach for the light and have it slip away? That kind of death doesn't end. It echoes, repeats, forever. Something scratched at the door, dragging across wood. Let us in. We're so cold. The water is so cold, the light is warm. We just want to be warm again. Marcus backed away. His training had no protocol for this. His rationality had no framework. You're not real. You're some kind of hallucination. Carbon monoxide from the generator, sleep deprivation, something in the water supply. The laughter that followed wasn't human. It sounded like water draining, like ice cracking, like the gurgle in a drowning man's throat. Test that theory, the voices said. Open the door. See how unreal we are. Marcus ran. Up the stairs, stumbling, catching himself on the railing. Behind him, the door burst open. He heard it slam against the interior wall. Heard the sound of movement, of multiple bodies dragging themselves across the floor with a wetness that suggested they brought the lake with them. Their voices followed him up the stairs, words in Old Norse that his mind somehow translated. The drowned are coming. The drowned always rise. The lake keeps what it takes. He reached the lantern room and slammed the hatch, engaging the lock. The thick metal provided some measure of security. Marcus grabbed the radio, tried again to raise anyone. Still nothing but static. He looked at his phone. No signal. The backup computer showed no internet connection. He was completely isolated. The scratching started on the hatch, those same 4 parallel line patterns he'd seen on the walls. Marcus realized now what they were. Finger marks, hands that had spent more than a century underwater, flesh worn away to expose the bone beneath, creating those distinctive claw patterns as they climbed. He positioned himself near the Fresnel lens, its rotating light the only illumination. Through the glass panels, he could see more figures climbing the cliff face. They moved like insects, clinging to vertical stone that no living person could scale. Their heads turned in unison to track the light's rotation, faces visible in each sweep. Marcus counted 30, 40, more. Not just the 9 from the Matafa. Every drowning victim from every wreck along this coast, perhaps. All of them drawn to the light that had failed them or their predecessors. The hatch began to buckle. Marcus looked at the light mechanism, understanding dawning with horrible clarity. They wanted the light extinguished, wanted the darkness. If ships foundered without warning, if more joined them in the depths, perhaps they wouldn't be so alone in their eternal drowning. Brennan's final words echoed in his memory. They want the light extinguished. They want the ships to join them. Marcus couldn't let that happen. Whatever these things were, whatever laws of nature they violated, he had to keep the light operational. Ships depended on it. The living depended on it. That duty transcended fear. The hatch burst open. They poured through, moving with unnatural speed, their bodies still dripping lake water that steamed in the lantern room's warmth. Marcus grabbed a flare from the emergency kit, fired it directly at the nearest figure. The magnesium burned white hot and the thing recoiled, a sound like screaming steam escaping. But there were too many. They surrounded the Fresnel lens, their wet hands reaching for the light mechanism. No! Marcus threw himself at them, felt his hands pass through cold that burned worse than fire. His fingers touched something solid within the cold, something with the texture of waterlogged flesh and the strength of cable. They grabbed him, pulled him toward the shattered hatch, toward the drop beyond. Their faces pressed close, showing him what waited: the eternal drowning. The cold darkness of Superior's depths, the endless replaying of those final moments of hope, dying in sight of safety. Marcus's fingers found the manual override for the light mechanism. He twisted it, increasing the rotation speed, cranking the light's intensity to maximum. The Fresnel lens blazed, its beam sweeping faster, brighter. The Draugr screamed, their voices like ice cracking, like water boiling. But they didn't release him. They were too far gone, too consumed by their need for company in the depths. He saw his reflection in one of their eyes, distorted in the milky cataract of long immersion, saw himself as they saw him, warm, alive, an insult to their frozen eternity. They would pull him down, would hold him under until the water filled his lungs, until he joined them in their endless drowning. The light wouldn't save him any more than it had saved them. Marcus did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed the flare gun, pressed it against his own thigh, and fired. The pain was instant and absolute, white-hot magnesium burning through cloth and skin. He screamed, and the scream seemed to surprise them. They loosened their grip for just a second. Marcus twisted free, fell hard against the lens mechanism, felt something in his shoulder tear. The burning flare had set his pants on fire. He rolled, trying to smother the flames, succeeded only in spreading the pain. But the drogger had retreated to the edges of the room, repelled by the fire, or perhaps by something else. The scent of burning flesh, the reminder of warmth, of life, of everything they'd lost. "I'm sorry," Marcus gasped through the pain. "I'm sorry you died. I'm sorry no one could save you, but I can't join you. I won't let you take anyone else." The lead figure, the one who'd spoken through the door, tilted its head. Water ran from its mouth when it spoke. "Then you'll stay here. Keep the light, like all the others. You'll watch the water. You'll wait for us. Every night. Forever. Until you can't remember what warmth felt like. Until the loneliness drives you into the lake voluntarily. That's the lighthouse keeper's fate. That's the price of the light." They flowed back through the hatch like water draining. Marcus heard them descending the stairs, leaving wet trails behind. He crawled to the hatch and looked down. Empty. The tower showed no signs of intrusion. Even the water trails were gone, evaporated, or never there. His leg was very badly burned. Marcus used the first aid kit to treat the wound as best he could, but he knew it needed real medical attention. He also knew something else with absolute certainty. If he left the lighthouse, ships would die. The drogger would ensure it. They'd create fog when fog shouldn't exist, currents where currents made no sense. They'd found ways to manipulate the natural world, or perhaps they'd become part of it, integrated into Lake Superior's deadly nature. The sun rose again, though Marcus's watch insisted only 2 hours had passed. Time worked differently in the lighthouse now. He radioed for help and this time got through, his voice calm and professional as he reported a medical emergency and requested immediate evacuation. The Coast Guard said they'd send a boat, 6 hours minimum in these conditions. Marcus kept the light running at maximum brightness. He sat in the lantern room and watched the lake. Sometimes he saw shapes in the water. Sometimes he heard voices in the wind. The boundary between real and imagined had become permeable, if it existed at all. When the Coast Guard cutter arrived, Marcus had already written his entries in the logbook. He described equipment malfunctions and a cooking accident that had caused his burns. Nothing about visitors or drogger or the drowned. They'd think him insane like Brennan. They'd certainly remove him from duty. And then who would keep the light? The Coast Guard officer who helped him aboard looked at Marcus with undisguised concern. "You look like hell, Sullivan. Brennan looked the same way when we pulled him out. What is it about this posting?" Marcus glanced back at the lighthouse standing stark against the gray sky. He could see figures on the rocks below, visible only from certain angles, in certain light. Waiting, always waiting. "Just the isolation," he said, "gets inside your head." They treated his burns at the hospital in Duluth. 2nd degree, painful but manageable. The doctors asked if he wanted psychiatric evaluation given the circumstances. Marcus declined. What could he tell them that wouldn't sound like delusion? Instead, he researched. The library in Duluth had archives, maritime history, local legends, Norse folklore brought by Scandinavian immigrants. The drogger appeared in dozens of accounts. The undead who guarded their death places, who dragged the living down to join them, who corrupted the living world with their presence. Salt could ward them off, but only if they died in salt water. Freshwater drogger, like those from Lake Superior, had no such weakness. Fire could hurt them, but not destroy them. They could influence the weather, the water, create disasters, and they never, ever let go of their grievances. Marcus found documentation of 9 lighthouse keepers at Split Rock who'd left under mysterious circumstances: medical leave, psychiatric reasons, unexplained disappearances. One had walked into the lake during a January storm and was never found. Another had been discovered in the lantern room, frozen solid despite the room's heating system, his face turned toward the water. 3 weeks later, Marcus's burns had healed enough that he returned to Split Rock. Not as the keeper, they'd assigned someone else temporarily, but to retrieve his belongings. He climbed the familiar path, entered the familiar quarters. The new keeper, a young woman named Jennifer, greeted him with forced cheerfulness that didn't mask her nervousness. "How are you finding it?" Marcus asked. Jennifer glanced at the windows overlooking the lake. "It's quiet, very quiet. I hear things at night sometimes, but that's just the wind, right?" Marcus didn't answer. He gathered his things, took a final look at the logbook. Jennifer had already started her entries. The handwriting was neat and controlled. For now. As he descended the path for what he thought would be the last time, Marcus stopped and looked back. Figures stood on the rocks below the cliff. 9 of them arranged in a line. They watched him with their milk cataract eyes. One raised a hand, fingers spread. 4 marks. The same pattern on the tower walls. Marcus understood the gesture. Not goodbye. See you soon. He thought of Jennifer alone in the lighthouse, thought of every keeper who would come after. They'd all face the same choice eventually: keep the light and lose themselves, or abandon the light and doom others. The Draugr had created a perfect trap. The lighthouse had to remain operational. Someone had to tend it, and whoever did would slowly be consumed by the isolation, the nightly visitations, the knowledge of what waited in the water. Marcus drove back to Duluth, but he didn't return to the Coast Guard. Instead, he rented a small apartment within sight of the lake. He spent his days researching Norse mythology, maritime folklore, lighthouse history, looking for something, anything that might break the cycle. Salt barriers didn't work. Fire only delayed them. Religious symbols had no effect. The Draugr predated Christianity, existed outside its framework. At night, Marcus dreamed. He stood in freezing water watching a lighthouse grow distant through a storm, reached for it desperately as the waves pulled him down, felt water fill his lungs, died seeing safety he couldn't reach, woke gasping, sheets soaked with sweat that smelled like lake water. The dreams came from them. The Draugr could reach him even in Duluth. Once you'd seen them, really seen them, you were marked, connected. Marcus had become part of their pattern, another life touched by their eternal drowning. He thought about Brennan often, wondered where the man was now, what he was doing. If he also dreamed of drowning. If he also watched the lake compulsively, unable to fully leave. The lighthouse created a bond between its keepers, living and dead. They all carried the same weight. 3 months after his departure, Marcus received a call. Jennifer had been evacuated, medical emergency. She'd suffered what doctors called a severe panic attack, but the attending psychiatrist noted signs of deeper trauma. She'd been screaming about dead men climbing the tower, about water that burned cold, about voices speaking languages that shouldn't exist. Marcus volunteered to return as interim keeper while they found a permanent replacement. The Coast Guard officer who processed his paperwork looked at him with something like pity. "You sure, Sullivan? After what happened?" "Someone has to keep the light," Marcus said. He returned to Split Rock on a gray morning in June. The path up the cliff felt like coming home, which disturbed him more than the Draugr had. He understood now why keepers kept returning, why some never left. The lighthouse had become part of them, or they'd become part of it. The distinction no longer seemed important. The logbook showed Jennifer's deterioration had taken less than 3 months. Her handwriting had gone from neat to frantic in that time. The final entry read, "They showed me how it feels. To drown. Over and over, I can't do this. But if I leave, If the light goes out, others will drown for real. How do you choose? How did Brennan choose? How did all the others? Marcus sat in the keeper's office and wrote his own entry. Date, weather, visibility. Then, carefully, understanding now that this is the cost. The lighthouse saves ships, but it consumes keepers. The Draugr have created a perfect system. We keep the light out of duty, even knowing what it will do to us. That dedication is what allows them to feed. Our choice to stay despite the horror. That's what they want. Not darkness, but our willing sacrifice to prevent it. That night they came. Marcus had expected them. He'd prepared by reading every account of Draugr encounters he could find. He'd tried protective symbols, salt lines, iron objects. Nothing worked. They passed through all barriers as easily as passing through water. But this time Marcus didn't run. He sat in the lantern room and waited as they climbed. When they emerged through the hatch, dripping and cold, he spoke. I understand now. You're not evil. You're just lost, trapped in the moment of your death, unable to move forward. The light represents what you lost: hope, warmth, life, and you hate it for that. The lead Draugr tilted its head. So you'll extinguish it? No, Marcus said. I'll keep it burning, but I'll do it knowing what it costs. What it's cost all of us. That's my choice. Not made from ignorance, but from understanding. They regarded him in silence. Water pooled on the floor. The light continued its rotation. You'll break, the Draugr said. They all break. Probably, Marcus agreed. But until then, the light stays on. They left without further violence. But Marcus knew they'd return. Every night, testing him, showing him their drowning, reminding him of the cold waiting in the lake. The isolation would compound it, the endless days and nights alone with only the drowned for company. Marcus thought of Brennan, of Jennifer, of all the keepers who'd stood where he stood now. They'd all made the same choice. Stay and suffer, or leave, and let others die. There was no third option. The Draugr had ensured that when they'd bound themselves to this place, when they'd chosen to haunt the lighthouse instead of passing on. Weeks passed. Marcus maintained the light, filed reports, watched the lake. The Draugr came every night without fail. Sometimes they tried to breach the lantern room. Sometimes they simply stood outside and stared. Always, they showed him their drowning, made him feel the water in his lungs, the cold, the despair. His handwriting in the logbook had begun to change. He noticed but couldn't stop it. The letters growing tighter, the lines more erratic. He was following the pattern, just like all the others. The question was how long he could last before he either abandoned the light or walked into the lake. Marcus's last rational thought, before the isolation and the nightly visits began blurring together, was that the lighthouse keeper's madness wasn't madness at all. It was the only sane response to an impossible situation. To see the Draugr was to know that death didn't end, that suffering could persist forever, that the universe allowed such things to exist. How could anyone witness that and remain unchanged? The light continued to turn. Ships passed safely through the night, and in the lantern room Marcus Sullivan watched and waited, understanding that he'd become part of an eternal cycle. The keepers and the drowned, bound together by duty and death and a light that never stopped burning. Sometimes, on particularly dark nights, Marcus thought he could hear all the previous keepers speaking. Their voices layered like water, words overlapping. They weren't warning him away. They were welcoming him. To the lighthouse. To the madness. To the understanding that some duties persist beyond reason, beyond sanity, beyond hope. The lake stretched endless and dark below. The light turned, and Marcus kept watch, knowing now that he'd never really leave. Even if they evacuated him, even if he physically departed, part of him would remain. The Draugr ensured that. Once you saw them, really saw them, you belonged to the lighthouse as surely as they did. The only question was how long until he joined them in the water,